I was actually driving. I had the cruise control set on 72, and I went off onto oncoming traffic across the highway and missed two semi trucks by 5 feet. My partner sat on both sides and hit a tree, and I had another seizure, and I don't know, somehow still here. So
in some people, having seizures can result in a compounded brain injury and debilitating cognitive effects. Some people have seizures that are very debilitating from a lifestyle perspective. You can imagine if you had a 16-year-old with seizures, they cannot drive.
There's been times he's turned the stove on accident. I've had to pull him away from fires. I've had to pull him away from the vanity sink, get him in the hallway, get him on a side, because they could become pretty intense.
Yeah, I was actually burning leaves in the backyard. My friend was over, and I was pouring the bag in there, and he goes, they were talking there, he's like, he's not looking right, and he's like, she goes, yeah, he's having one. I was falling, I guess, forward, and he had to pull me away and drag me basically by my feet.
It's hard for them to have friends and go to school because they always get sent home, so it's very debilitating to have multiple seizures.
At first they said he wasn't epileptic, and then he kept having them like back to back to where they were becoming grand mal. And so it was just, he told him, he goes, it can be gruesome, like it's a series of tests, like a bunch. I mean, we've gone through probably, he said it could take 6 months to a year. It's probably been about the year mark of the test.
If someone has seizures, we do a number of non-invasive tests before we ever get into any kind of surgery. And sometimes with that type of investigation, and if you add to that certain MRI findings, you can actually determine that their seizures are coming from here and operate very quickly. Other times it's much more difficult to tell. You know, there are some people, for example, that have seizures coming from one temporal lobe and the other temporal lobe, or they're coming so quickly or spreading so quickly, we can't tell which side they're coming from. You cannot take out two temporal lobes. You can take out one, not the other. At the end of all those investigations, we get together and have a conference. We've done all of these tests to see where the seizures are coming from. How convinced are we that that's where it's coming from? And sometimes we don't know. Sometimes we really don't. Sometimes we have a clue, but that gives us something to target with surgery. So in that case, we have the option of either putting electrodes right on the brain in the subdural space. You can put a large piece of plastic with electrodes on the brain with the electrodes sticking out of the scalp. You can slide some under the brain. That gives you an idea as to what's going on the surface of the brain. Very much more sensitive than a scalp electrode. That technology has been supplanted by this idea to insert stereotactic electrodes, which are thin little wires that are sticks that you insert into the brain in very specific parts of the brain. And for that, we use robotics. It's impossible otherwise. So what those electrodes are doing are measuring from not just the surface of the brain where they go in, but into the brain where we think seizures are coming from anyway. And what the robot does is allows us to place those electrodes into the brain with sub-millimeter accuracy. Because you can imagine, putting a stick into the brain, you have to avoid critical structures, you have to hit your target, and you have to avoid blood vessels. So that allows us to do sub-millimeter accuracy, so it's fantastic technology and essential for any surgical epilepsy center.
I had the 16 holes drilled in my head with his robot, as he calls it.
We performed that surgery at Cardinal Glennon Children's Hospital, despite him being an adult, because that's where the robot lives. So Brady Rising was worked up by our adult surgical epilepsy team. And in his case, we actually had a hypothesis that it might be either temporal lobe. So our plan was to insert electrodes left side, right side.
So it was trying to see if it was coming from the left side or the right side. Unfortunately, I had them from both sides.
So unfortunately, not a candidate for a surgical resection. But what we did offer him was a very new technology called responsive neurostimulation. Our investigations did localize the seizures to the hippocampus on both sides of the brain, left and right. There were multiple surgical options. He decided on the one which I thought was the best, which was this responsive neurostimulation. And what that does is that has us insert those similar types of electrodes using the same robot right down the barrel of the hippocampus in both sides in an operation. We connect those electrodes to a computer and generator that actually replaces his skull and sits under the scalp.
Here's the device that's in my head now, so.
And what that computer does is it constantly reads electrical activity from those areas of the brain that are very, very active. If it senses a seizure, it can actually fire a signal and hopefully abort that seizure before it happens.
I just go on here and you hit step 2, interrogate, and then it identifies, and I stick it right on top, and it tells you the quality on the computer and the status of how fast it's going. It's gathering the information, and I just leave the wand on the same spot until that green line is all the way at the end.
The advantage of that technology as well is that over time you're gathering information over days to weeks to months. So eventually, after potentially 6 months to a year, we may be able to look at all the information we've gathered and say, hey, you know what? 95% of your seizures come from the left, with very few that start on the right. So if we offered then a temporal lobectomy on the left, if the seizures are still not controlled with this technology, then potentially we can do a better job at controlling the seizures overall. But I have inserted that type of technology in a girl with similar left and right temporal seizures, and she was so satisfied with it, she didn't need anything else.
I haven't had one other than forced ones from the hospital or from those big tests I've had. So they just gave me my license back finally. So
the biggest thing is an adjustment, because he's so used to living the life of, I don't know what's going to happen today. Mm-hmm. And he can actually take a deep breath now. That's what's been the biggest adjustment, is that he doesn't have to live in fear so much anymore.
It's very satisfying to actually rid someone of their seizures that they've had for usually years and years and years. And eventually, sometimes we can actually remove them off any of the medications that they're on. A perfect result is classified as an angle of 1, which means no more seizures. You could still be on medication, but there are some kids we can actually take them off medications and not even have the side effects of those medications. And for families, it's life-altering. That's what we've trained to do, and it's very, very rewarding.